Welcome to Jamaica, land of wood and water, named long before Columbus got lost and started naming things as if nobody lived here. Today, most people call it Jamaica, Caribbean jewel, reggae birthplace, cultural heavyweight. But beneath the beaches and the vibes stands an island forged through centuries of resistance. Look left. The Blue Mountain Ridge cuts the horizon like a stone spine. Beautiful, right? Yeah. That ridge has been a hideout, a battlefield, and a liberated zone. It remembers everything. We're in the Greater Antilles, south of Cuba, west of Haiti. 14 modern parishes stretch across this island, from the calm waters of Portland to the cane-scorched plains of Clarendon, to the cocky swagger of Kingston, the place that writes culture like it's collecting overdue rent. But rewind to 1494, when Columbus arrived and wrote in his journal about discovering lands already full of Taino communities who farmed cassava, built canais, and ran trade networks across the Caribbean. They watched the Spaniards step ashore in armor in tropical heat, a poor life choice, and probably thought, these people look lost and dehydrated. Fast forward, empires would clash here, plantation owners would build fortunes off human suffering, and people, indigenous, African, and later indentured arrivals, would carve paths of survival and revolt. And if you look closely at that mountain ridge, it's quiet now. But that silence carries centuries of resistance. Picture St. Anne around the year 1400. Dense forests draped in perpetual humidity. Cassava fields stretching between communal villages. Dugout canoes pulled up along the coast, where limestone cliffs meet turquoise water. The Taino people, descendants of Arawakan migrations that had moved through the Caribbean for centuries, built sophisticated societies across the island they called Jamaica. These weren't scattered camps of simple farmers. They were organized ukayekes with hierarchical leadership under caciques, ball courts for ceremonial games called bati, and trade networks connecting Jamaica to Cuba, Hispaniola, and islands throughout the Antilles. In St. Mary and Portland, archaeological sites reveal carved duhos, ceremonial seats for chiefs that demonstrated both artistry and political authority, zamis representing ancestral spirits and natural forces, and shell tools crafted with remarkable precision. Cassava was grated on wooden boards, the poisonous juice squeezed out, then baked into flatbread called casabe on clay ovens that filled villages with smoke and the smell of sustenance. Cotton hammocks swung in the breeze between wooden posts. Fishing traps woven from reeds caught snapper and grouper in coastal waters. Spiritual life centered on cohoba ceremonies, where shamans called bahiks inhaled sacred powders made from tree seeds and communed with ancestors, seeking guidance for planting, healing, and warfare. Nothing about this was primitive, just practical, sustainable, and deeply interconnected with the land and sea. Taino agriculture used the Canuco system, raised mounds that prevented erosion and maximized yield. They cultivated not just cassava, but also sweet potatoes, maize, peppers, peanuts, and cotton. They kept hutias, small rodents, as protein sources. Their technology matched their environment perfectly. The Spanish chronicler Bartolomé de las Casas, who arrived decades after first contact and witnessed the devastation firsthand, described Taino society with genuine admiration in his Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias. He noted their generosity, a cultural value so strong that refusing to share was considered shameful, their agricultural knowledge, and their peaceful governance structures. You know, the kind of functioning society Europeans would later insist they invented. Population estimates vary wildly among historians, but perhaps 60,000 Taino lived on Jamaica when Columbus arrived, organized into provinces under regional caciques who maintained both autonomy and alliances. They had cosmologies explaining creation and natural forces, kinship structures that determined inheritance and responsibility, conflict resolution systems that relied more on negotiation than violence. They laughed, argued, danced aretos under starlight, ceremonies combining dance, song, and oral history, raised children with clear expectations and communal support, told stories that passed knowledge across generations. These were people fully at home in their land, not footnotes waiting for a conquest narrative to begin. They had been here for 8 centuries. They belonged. Then 1494 happened, and everything tilted. Christopher Columbus touched Jamaica's north coast on May 5, 1494, during his second voyage to what he still believed was Asia, landing near what's now St. Anne's Bay. He wrote in his journal that the island was the fairest that eyes have beheld, which sounds like poetry but reads more like real estate assessment, tourist brochure language for "I'm already calculating profit margins." Spain claimed Jamaica immediately, though they didn't establish permanent settlements until 1509, when conquistador Juan de Esquivel founded Sevilla la Nueva in St. Anne. The Spanish looked around, poked into rivers and mountains searching for gold deposits, didn't find the precious metal they desperately wanted, and pivoted to Plan B. If there's no gold in the ground, extract value from people and livestock. The encomienda system, a legal fiction that granted Spanish colonists guardianship over indigenous people in exchange for supposedly Christianizing them and teaching European ways, turned Taino communities in St. Catherine and Clarendon into forced labor pools. Officially, the Spanish were teaching faith and civilization. Actually, they were running cattle ranches, demanding labor for building projects in Spanish Town and other settlements, and sending Taino divers to harvest pearls off the south coast until their lungs gave out. The system was slavery with paperwork. Disease arrived faster than Spanish bureaucracy ever could. Smallpox, influenza, measles, and other European epidemics ripped through indigenous populations with no immunity to Old World pathogens. Spanish census fragments show catastrophic decline. Communities that numbered in thousands shrank to hundreds within decades. By 1611, Spanish records claimed only 74 Taino remained on the island, though this likely undercounted those who had fled to mountains or intermarried with African escapees. Colonial records from Governor Francisco de Garay's administration complained constantly about rebellious Indians, refusing work assignments, abandoning encomiendas, and generally being uncooperative with their own exploitation, as if enslaved people should be grateful for the opportunity to die building someone else's fortune. But Taino people resisted in every way available to them. Some fled to the mountains of St. Thomas, forming early Maroon-style hideouts in the rugged John Crow Range where Spanish soldiers rarely ventured. Others burned fields and buildings, sabotaged equipment, killed livestock to undermine ranch profitability. When the first enslaved Africans arrived in the 1510s and 1520s, early Cimarrones who escaped Spanish control and headed for the hills, some Taino communities allied with them, sharing survival knowledge, mountain trails, and common cause against Spanish violence. Spain never managed to properly control Jamaica. The interior remained largely unknown and unmapped to them. The cattle ran semi-feral across unfenced plains, and the whole colonial project limped along, generating just enough profit to avoid total abandonment, but never becoming the jewel the Spanish had imagined. Indigenous Jamaica didn't disappear into thin air. It transformed, intermarried into later communities, and left genetic, cultural, and linguistic traces in Maroon and Mestizo populations that followed. Then Britain showed up in 1655 with bigger ships, more soldiers, and even bigger entitlement. In May 1655, English Admiral William Penn, father of Pennsylvania's founder, and General Robert Venables arrived at what's now Kingston Harbor with roughly 8,000 soldiers and sailors. They were supposedly sailing from Barbados to attack Santo Domingo as part of Cromwell's Western design to seize Spanish Caribbean territories. But they got thoroughly defeated there by Spanish defenders and local militias. So they pivoted mid-campaign to Jamaica because, well, when your imperial invasion fails spectacularly, you don't sail home empty-handed. You just invade somewhere else and hope nobody notices the downgrade. The Spanish garrison on Jamaica was weak, undermanned, undersupplied, and caught completely off guard. Within weeks, the English claimed military victory and sent smug letters back to Oliver Cromwell describing their conquest, carefully omitting the part about Santo Domingo. But the Spanish, retreating from coastal settlements into the interior mountains of St. Andrew and St. James, didn't leave alone. Spanish Governor Cristobal Arnaldo de Isasi freed enslaved Africans and armed them to wage guerrilla war against the English occupation. Except those newly freed people, who had been watching Spanish and English empires destroy each other, took one look at the situation and made a different calculation. Why fight for Spain when we could fight for ourselves? They disappeared into the mountains, taking Spanish weapons with them, and became the core of Jamaica's first major Maroon communities, autonomous, armed, and determined to stay free. The English spent the next several decades trying to pacify the interior, which is colonial bureaucratic language for getting ambushed repeatedly by people who knew the terrain intimately and had every reason to stay free. Maroon fighters used the dense forests of the Blue Mountains and the labyrinthine cockpit country to devastating tactical effect. British soldiers wrote panicked reports about being lost in the woods for days, supplies running dangerously low, suffering coordinated attacks from enemies they couldn't see, and retreating in disorder. The mountains swallowed British expeditions whole. Meanwhile, Port Royal, the new English base built on a sandy spit at the entrance to Kingston Harbor, became the Caribbean's wildest port almost overnight. Privateers sailing under English letters of marque, outright pirates looking for safe harbor, merchants trading in everything legal and illegal, and enslaved dock workers loading ships created a chaotic, violent, fantastically profitable hub. Taverns outnumbered churches. Wealth flowed through like rum. The English were planting their flag and building infrastructure. But stability? That was nowhere near guaranteed. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 formalized British control, with Spain officially ceding Jamaica in exchange for English promises to stop attacking Spanish shipping. Promises both sides knew were meaningless. But treaties only mattered on paper and in European capitals. In Jamaica's mountains, the Maroons controlled their own territory, and they were just getting started building their republics. Britain looked at Jamaica after securing legal title and saw one thing: money. By the 1670s, English merchants and planters had learned from Barbados that sugar was white gold, the most profitable agricultural commodity in the world, and Jamaica had more available land, better rainfall patterns, and fewer regulatory restrictions than overcrowded Barbados. By the early 1700s, the island was systematically carpeted with sugar estates, particularly across the fertile plains of Clarendon, the rolling hills of Westmoreland, and the coastal lands of St. Thomas in the east. Cane fields stretched like scorched green oceans to every horizon. Mills ground day and night during harvest season. Smoke rose constantly from boiling houses where enslaved workers stirred molten sugar in cauldron heat that could literally melt skin off bone. The plantation machine required labor, massive, constant, backbreaking, and as cheap as possible. So Britain built the machinery of the transatlantic slave trade directly into Jamaica's economic foundation, dragging hundreds of thousands of Africans across the Middle Passage in conditions so brutal that roughly 15% died during the voyage itself. Igbo, Akan, Yoruba, Congo, Mandinka, different nations, languages, spiritual systems, and political traditions forced into one dehumanizing system designed to extract maximum labor before death. Between 1655 and 1807, over 600,000 enslaved Africans were forcibly brought to Jamaica. Mortality rates were so catastrophically high, from overwork, malnutrition, disease, and violence, that the enslaved population only sustained itself through constant new arrivals. Planters calculated that buying new enslaved people was cheaper than keeping workers alive. Plantation ledgers from estates in Clarendon and Westmoreland, preserved in colonial archives, show the bureaucratic horror with chilling clarity. Names, ages, work assignments, punishments, births, deaths, monetary value, all recorded in neat columns like inventory lists. Enslaved people were listed as property alongside cattle and equipment, their economic value calculated against sugar crop yields and estate profitability. Governor Thomas Modiford's correspondence from the 1660s and 1670s celebrates Jamaica's rapid transformation into a sugar powerhouse, praising planters who turned wilderness into wealth, completely erasing both the indigenous people who'd lived there for centuries and the enslaved Africans being worked to death. Daily life on sugar estates meant waking before dawn to the sound of the conch shell horn, working until dusk cutting cane under merciless tropical sun with machetes that dulled quickly and fingers that bled, hauling loads that wrecked backs and destroyed knees, then working brutal night shifts in boiling houses where the heat was so intense, workers sometimes collapsed from heat stroke or suffered horrific burns from molten sugar. Punishments for resistance, slowdowns, or insolence were systematized with bureaucratic precision. Whippings counted and recorded, iron collars that prevented sleep, leg shackles that caused infection, solitary confinement in stone cells without light or adequate food. Yet resistance began immediately and never stopped. Enslaved people broke tools in ways that looked like accidents, feigned illness convincingly, slowed work pace collectively, met secretly at night in the provision grounds to preserve spiritual practices and plan escapes. Obeah, spiritual knowledge from West African religious traditions combined with indigenous Caribbean practices, became simultaneously a tool of psychological warfare against enslavers, a healing system, and a way to maintain cultural identity. Drumming carried coded messages across estates faster than any official communication. Songs layered double meanings that sailed completely over white overseers' heads. Kinship networks formed despite constant sale and family separation, creating support systems that gave people reasons to survive. The plantation system was profitable beyond British merchants' wildest dreams, yes, but it was never stable, never secure, never the well-oiled machine planters imagined. Every barrel of sugar exported to England was soaked in resistance. The British imagined plantations as efficient machines running on interchangeable labor, with enslaved people as cogs that could be replaced when they broke down. But enslaved communities waged daily, strategic, relentless resistance that constantly disrupted the system in ways large and small. In St. Mary during the 1740s, plantation records mention an enslaved cooper named Kwasi who absconded for 3 days. Planters called it theft of property and dereliction, but Kwasi was visiting family members on a neighboring estate, maintaining kinship ties the system tried to sever. Women on estates in St. Catherine poisoned hogs and chickens, destroying planters' secondary income streams. Boats disappeared from docks in the middle of the night, providing escape routes. Fires mysteriously broke out in cane fields just before harvest, when months of work was most vulnerable, and somehow no one ever saw who started them. Thomas Thistlewood, a British overseer and small planter who kept disturbingly detailed diaries from his years on a Westmoreland estate starting in 1750, documented his constant paranoia with remarkable clarity. His writings, graphic, disturbing, but historically invaluable, reveal the anxious daily reality of plantation life for enslavers. They feared poison in their food. They feared nighttime coordination among enslaved people. They feared the numerical superiority of those they oppressed, and above all, they feared the mountains where Maroons lived completely free. Thistlewood recorded punishments with sadistic precision, sexual violence with casual brutality. But between every line you can read his underlying terror. He knew the system only held together because of overwhelming, exhausting, constant violence. And violence is impossible to sustain indefinitely. Enslaved people ran elaborate intelligence networks that would impress modern organizers. Information traveled faster through slave quarters than through official colonial channels. When a ship arrived from Barbados or Antigua with news from other islands, enslaved dock workers in Kingston spread word within hours across multiple estates. When a planter died, or a new overseer was appointed, everyone on surrounding estates knew his reputation, his weaknesses, his vulnerabilities immediately. Spiritual leaders, particularly Obeah practitioners, held authority that no British law could touch or even fully understand, providing healing, counsel, psychological support, and sometimes the strategic coordination for escapes and resistance. Court records from St. James in the 1750s show enslaved people regularly brought before magistrates for conspiracy, plotting rebellion, and rebellious assembly. The British tried desperately to legislate submission into existence. Laws banning drums and horns, limiting movement between estates, requiring written passes for any travel, imposing strict curfews, prohibiting gatherings of more than 3 enslaved people. None of it worked. You can't legislate people into accepting their own dehumanization, and you can't prevent humans from finding ways to resist. Some resistance was individual, one person escaping to the mountains to join Maroon communities. Some was collective, entire work gangs strategically slowing production until an overseer was removed or conditions improved marginally. All of it mattered. All of it chipped away at the system. Power looked absolute on paper in ledgers and legal codes, but in daily practice it was contested every single hour. And then came the revolts that made the entire system tremble. In April 1760, in St. Mary Parish, an enslaved man named Tacky, an Akan leader from the Gold Coast, who had been a military commander in West Africa before enslavement, organized what became the largest and most sophisticated slave revolt in 18th century Jamaica. This wasn't spontaneous rage exploding without direction. This was coordinated military warfare with clear objectives. On the night of April 7th, Tacky and a core group of allies raided the armory at Port Maria, seizing weapons and ammunition in a swift, organized operation. By dawn on Easter Monday, they had killed overseers at Frontier and Trinity estates and were moving strategically across the parish, rallying others to join the uprising. War drums echoed across the hills, the same drums the British had tried repeatedly to ban, now announcing liberation and coordinating military movements. Within days, rebellion spread like wildfire to St. Thomas in the east, St. George, and other parishes across the island. An estimated 1,000 enslaved people joined the revolt directly, with many thousands more providing support, intelligence, and supplies. The revolt was distinctly military in nature, drawing on Akan martial traditions and African military organization. Tacky's forces used guerrilla tactics brilliantly, ambushed British troops repeatedly, controlled territory for weeks, and demonstrated sophisticated command structure. Governor Henry Moore sent increasingly frantic dispatches to London begging for military reinforcements, writing that the island was on the verge of total destruction and that the rebellion threatened to overthrow British control entirely. British regular troops struggled against fighters who knew the terrain intimately and fought with absolutely everything to lose. Controversially, the British recruited Maroons from Accompong and Scots Hall to track the rebels. A painful chapter in Maroon history, where their 1739 treaty obligations to return runaways collided directly with ethnic and racial solidarity. Some Maroons participated reluctantly, viewing it as an unpleasant necessity to preserve their own hard-won autonomy. Others saw it as protecting their communities from British retaliation. Tacky was eventually killed in combat by a Maroon marksman in June 1760, but the rebellion continued into October with pockets of fierce resistance across the island. The British crushed the revolt finally with overwhelming military brutality. Over 60 whites were killed during the uprising, but approximately 400 enslaved people were executed in its aftermath, with hundreds more sold off the island to certain death in other colonies. Bodies were displayed on roadsides as warnings. Captured rebel leaders were burned alive in public executions designed to terrorize. But strategically, psychologically, the revolt terrified Jamaica's plantocracy in ways that never fully healed. It proved definitively that enslaved people weren't docile labor units. They were strategic thinkers, military organizers, and people capable of nearly overthrowing the entire colonial system. Insurance rates for plantations spiked dramatically. Militia spending tripled. White planters slept less soundly. The psychological victory belonged entirely to the rebels. Jamaica would never feel safe or stable again. The mountains of Jamaica, particularly the impenetrable Cockpit country in St. James and the mist-shrouded Blue Mountains stretching through Portland, became sovereign zones controlled by Maroon communities. These weren't temporary hideouts or refugee camps. These were functioning societies with sophisticated governance systems, sustainable agriculture, military organization, and cultural continuity stretching directly back to the 1650s Spanish period, and even incorporating some indigenous Taíno influences. Nanny Town, perched in the Blue Mountains near Portland, and later Moore Town, was led by Queen Nanny, an Akan woman whose leadership brilliantly combined military strategy, spiritual authority, and shrewd political acumen. Oral histories preserved through generations describe her catching bullets, either literally through spiritual power or metaphorically through tactical genius, outsmarting British officers repeatedly and organizing defensive networks that made Nanny Town nearly impregnable despite numerous British military expeditions. British military reports called her a sorceress who bewitched soldiers and made them lose their way, which is transparently colonial language for, "We kept losing battles, and we don't want to admit she outmaneuvered us tactically." Cudjoe commanded the Western Maroons based at Trelawny Town in St. James, deep in Cockpit country's limestone maze. His forces conducted brilliantly executed ambushes using the region's natural geography, sinkholes called cockpits, dense bush, hidden trails, to devastating tactical effect against British troops. British soldiers wrote reports about being confounded by the woods, unable to track Maroon fighters who moved silently, struck without warning, then disappeared into terrain that swallowed pursuing forces whole. By the late 1730s, Britain had spent decades and enormous resources failing to subdue the Maroons militarily. The First Maroon War, 1728-1740, drained British coffers and military morale. In March 1739, British Colonel Guthrie negotiated a treaty with Cudjoe's Western Maroons, followed by a similar 1740 treaty with the Eastern Maroons under Quao. The treaties granted Maroons 1,500 acres of land in St. James, legal autonomy, and the right to self-governance under their own leaders. But there was a morally painful clause that haunts Maroon history. Maroons agreed to return future runaways and assist British authorities in suppressing slave rebellions. This created a profound contradiction. Freedom purchased partly through agreeing to police others' continued unfreedom. Some historians defend it as pragmatic survival in an impossible situation where refusal meant military annihilation. Others call it strategic betrayal of solidarity. Both perspectives can be historically true simultaneously. What remains undeniable? The treaties represented one of the first legally recognized autonomous black republics in the Americas. Moortown, Accompong, Charlestown, and Scots Hall became sovereign communities that persisted through centuries, maintaining distinct identities. The abeng, the cow horn instrument used to send coded messages across mountains during warfare, became an enduring symbol of freedom that no colonial power could silence. Freedom carved into mountains through blood and brilliance fundamentally changed the island's future trajectory. In August 1791, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, the western third of Hispaniola that would become Haiti, rose up against French colonial rule in the largest and most successful slave revolt in human history. By 1804, after 13 years of revolutionary warfare, they had militarily defeated France, Spain, and Britain, the three most powerful European empires, and established the world's first independent black republic and second independent nation in the Americas after the United States. News of Haiti's revolution arrived in Kingston and Spanish Town through multiple channels. Sailors docking at Kingston Harbor, carrying stories and newspapers, printed materials read aloud in taverns and markets, and whispered urgent conversations among enslaved dock workers who loaded and unloaded ships carrying refugees, trade goods, rumors, and revolutionary ideas across the Caribbean. For Jamaica's enslaved population, Haiti became an ideological lighthouse, illuminating the possibility of freedom. If France, the wealthiest, most powerful colonial power in the Caribbean, could be militarily defeated by enslaved people, then British slavery wasn't invincible or permanent either. Enslaved people passed stories from ship to shore with growing excitement. They defeated Napoleon's armies. They declared themselves free and independent. Toussaint Louverture commanded disciplined armies. Jean-Jacques Dessalines won final independence. Every colonial governor on Jamaica suddenly developed severe stress migraines and paranoia. Shipping records from Kingston in the early 1800s show dramatically increased maritime traffic between Jamaica and Haiti, with British merchants simultaneously nervous about both trade disruption and ideological contagion spreading to Jamaica's plantations. Jamaica's white planters reinforced militia units, imposed even stricter slave codes, lobbied Britain constantly to maintain naval blockades around Haiti to prevent contact, and lived in mounting fear of their own Haitian-style revolution. British colonial authorities officially banned any news from Haiti, legally forbade enslaved people from discussing the revolution, and severely punished those caught spreading what they termed seditious ideas about black independence and self-governance. None of these desperate measures worked. You can't unring a bell once it's been rung. The Haitian Revolution electrified the entire Caribbean, proving conclusively that freedom wasn't a gift to wait patiently for from benevolent masters. It was something enslaved people could take through organized resistance and military force. By the 1820s, abolitionist movements in Britain were gaining significant political momentum, fueled partly by the economic decline of Caribbean sugar in global markets and partly by moral arguments from Quakers, evangelical Christians, and other religious reform groups. But Jamaica's enslaved communities weren't passively waiting for British Parliament to debate their basic humanity in comfortable London chambers. They were actively planning something entirely different. December 27, 1831. In St. James Parish, enslaved people across multiple estates simultaneously stopped working. It wasn't spontaneous chaos. It wasn't unplanned rage exploding randomly. It was a carefully coordinated labor strike organized over months by Samuel Sharp, an enslaved Baptist deacon who could read English, preached regularly at Birchall Baptist Church in Montego Bay, and had been secretly organizing resistance across western Jamaica. Sharp's strategic plan was elegant in its simplicity: collectively refuse to work after Christmas holidays unless paid fair wages as free laborers. He genuinely believed that emancipation was imminent. Rumors were swirling constantly about British abolition debates in Parliament, and he argued persuasively that enslaved people should simply act as if they were already legally free. No more unpaid labor, no more whips and chains. Just collectively stop and demand wages. But white planters, predictably, responded immediately with violence rather than negotiation. What Samuel Sharp intended as a peaceful labor strike transformed rapidly into the largest slave rebellion in Jamaican history, later called either the Baptist War or the Christmas Rebellion. Within days, an estimated 60,000 enslaved people across St. James, Hanover, Trelawny, and Westmoreland joined the uprising. They systematically burned cane fields, destroyed sugar works and mills, and fought back fiercely against militia forces sent to suppress them. The western parishes literally lit up with fire, both literal flames consuming plantations and metaphorical fire of rebellion. Baptist mission records carefully document both the rebellion's scope and British panic. Missionaries who had taught enslaved people to read scripture and discussed Christian concepts of equality and human dignity were arrested as supposed instigators. Churches were burned by white mobs. The British colonial government deployed overwhelming military force. Regular British Army troops, local white militia units, and Maroon auxiliaries. Over 2 intense weeks in January 1832, the rebellion was crushed with brutal, systematic efficiency. The British executed over 300 identified rebels in the immediate aftermath. Samuel Sharp was captured, tried in a rushed proceeding, and hanged in the Montego Bay town square on May 23, 1832. His final words, carefully recorded by multiple witnesses, became legendary. "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." They became a rallying cry echoed across generations. The rebellion's impact terrified the British establishment. Property damage exceeded $1 million, an astronomical sum. More importantly, strategically, it demonstrated conclusively that Jamaican slavery was economically unsustainable. The cost of maintaining the system through constant military suppression was beginning to exceed its profitability. Within 2 years, British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, effective August 1, 1834. Emancipation wasn't graciously granted as a humanitarian gift from enlightened Europeans. It was forced through Parliament by decades of sustained resistance, with Samuel Sharp's rebellion serving as the final decisive push. On August 1, 1834, slavery officially ended across the British Empire in a moment celebrated across Jamaica. Enslaved people, over 300,000 souls, woke up legally free after generations of bondage. Except Britain, being characteristically British, had added extensive fine print to freedom. Instead of immediate, unconditional emancipation, the Abolition Act of 1833 created an apprenticeship system that was transparently just slavery, rebranded with updated terminology and new official stationery. Former slaves were legally reclassified as apprentices and required to continue working unpaid for their former enslavers for 4 to 6 years, supposedly to transition gradually to free wage labor and allow planters to adjust to the new system. In St. Thomas and St. Catherine, apprentices worked the exact same brutal hours in the exact same cane fields under the exact same overseers and managers. They could still be whipped for infractions. Officially corrected with reasonable punishment. They needed written permission to leave estates. They had no legal right to refuse work assignments. The only substantive change was semantic. Detailed reports from stipendiary magistrates, British officials specifically appointed to oversee the apprenticeship system and theoretically protect apprentices. Document constant. Widespread resistance. Apprentices filed literally thousands of formal complaints documenting illegal punishments, excessive work hours far beyond treaty terms, deliberately withheld food provisions, and systematic sexual abuse. Some conscientious magistrates genuinely tried to enforce fairness and punish abusive planters. Most sided reflexively with white property owners. Organized work refusals became increasingly common across estates. Mass petitions demanding full immediate freedom reached London regularly, signed by thousands. By 1838, the apprenticeship system was collapsing under its own glaring contradictions and sustained resistance. Apprentices collectively refused to cooperate with the charade. Free black Jamaicans organized boycotts of apprentice-produced goods. Abolitionist pressure in Britain intensified dramatically. On August 1, 1838, 4 years later than it morally should have been, apprenticeship officially ended. Full legal emancipation finally arrived, real and unconditional. Freedom, as always throughout Jamaican history, required constant organized pressure and resistance to achieve. But plantation owners weren't remotely finished exploiting labor. After full emancipation in 1838, they faced an immediate labor crisis. Free black Jamaicans overwhelmingly refused to work for starvation wages in the exact same cane fields where they and their families had been enslaved, tortured, and worked to death for generations. So planters looked elsewhere internationally, importing workers under indenture contracts that appeared legal on official paper but functioned as exploitative labor traps. Between 1845 and 1917, over 36,000 workers arrived from India under formal government programs, plus thousands more from China, hundreds from Madeira, and even small numbers from West Africa. They landed at Kingston Docks and were dispersed to estates in Clarendon, St. Mary, Westmoreland, and other parishes, signing contracts explicitly promising wages, housing, medical care, and guaranteed return passage after 5 years of contracted labor. Daily reality proved dramatically different from contractual promises. Indian and Chinese indentured workers faced systematically brutal conditions. Overcrowded, unsanitary barracks, routinely withheld or reduced wages, illegal contract extensions through manufactured debt, physical punishment for resistance, and elaborate debt traps that made return passage functionally impossible for most. Immigration contracts preserved in colonial archives show deliberate systematic deception. Wages promised clearly in writing, then paid in company scrip usable only at plantation-owned stores with deliberately inflated prices that ensured workers remained perpetually indebted. Yet despite the exploitative system designed to break them, indentured communities not only survived, but built vibrant new cultural layers that permanently enriched Jamaica's multi-ethnic identity. Indian workers brought Hindu and Muslim religious practices, languages including Bhojpuri and Hindi, festivals like Hosai commemorating Muharram, and culinary traditions, roti, curry goat, dal, aloo, that became beloved Jamaican staples. Chinese workers established small shops, cultivated vegetables using specialized techniques, maintained community associations and kinship networks. Despite everything designed to exploit them, these arrivals fundamentally enriched Jamaica. Post-emancipation plantations survived economically by continually reinventing labor exploitation, importing global workers to replace the people who'd rightfully walked away from sites of their trauma. On October 11, 1865, in Morant Bay, St. Thomas Parish, decades of accumulated frustration and injustice exploded into violent confrontation. Paul Bogle, a Black Baptist deacon and small independent farmer, led a march of roughly 400 people to the local courthouse. They were demanding concrete justice, legal access to land, fair treatment in courts systematically biased against Black Jamaicans, and relief from crushing poverty that had persisted 17 years after nominal emancipation. Tensions had been systematically building for years across St. Thomas. Former slaves had received absolutely no land, no economic reparations, no material support to build free lives. Meanwhile, white planters still controlled local politics completely, dominated court systems, and monopolized resources. Magistrates routinely ruled against Black farmers in property disputes. Voting restrictions kept the vast majority of Black Jamaicans completely disenfranchised. When Bogle's group attempted to protest peacefully at the courthouse, local volunteer militia opened fire without warning. Immediate violence erupted. The courthouse burned. 18 officials and militia members died in the chaos. Bogle's supporters, now a full-scale rebellion spreading rapidly, moved through St. Thomas Parish, attacking visible symbols of systemic injustice and colonial authority. But Governor Edward John Eyre responded with overwhelming, disproportionate, brutal military force. He declared martial law across the entire parish, deployed regular British troops, and unleashed a deliberate campaign of terror and repression that killed over 430 people, flogged hundreds more with calculated sadism, and burned over 1,000 homes to ash. George William Gordon, a mixed-race elected politician and Bogle's political ally who had been vocally advocating for poor Jamaicans in the colonial assembly, was arrested in Kingston, technically outside martial law jurisdiction, forcibly transported to Morant Bay, tried by a rushed military court-martial with no proper legal representation, and hanged on October 23, 1865. The trial was transparently a sham, rushed through specifically to silence political dissent. Eyewitness testimonies sent back to Britain described summary executions without trial, mass public floggings designed to terrorize communities, and entire villages systematically razed. Eyre's extreme actions sparked major controversy and moral outrage in England, bitterly dividing British public opinion and eventually leading to his official recall. But in Jamaica itself, the colonial message was brutally clear. Organized resistance would be crushed with maximum force. Yet despite immediate defeat, Morant Bay became a crucial turning point in Jamaican political consciousness and national memory. Paul Bogle and George William Gordon were later officially recognized as national heroes. Their courageous stand against systematic injustice remembered and honored as a defining moment in the island's long, continuous struggle for rights, justice, and genuine representation. By the 1930s, Jamaica's collective patience had completely expired. Decades after emancipation, the vast majority of Black Jamaicans still lived in grinding poverty, landless, severely underpaid, and politically voiceless. Sugar profits flowed steadily to British shareholders in London, while workers in Jamaica literally starved. On May 2, 1938, dock workers at Kingston's busy waterfront went on strike demanding better wages and working conditions. Within days, labor unrest exploded across the entire island in a wave of anger that had been building for generations. Cane cutters in Westmoreland, banana workers in Portland, urban poor in Spanish Town, all joined, effectively shutting down Jamaica's entire economy. Labor Riot Commission reports document the unprecedented scale: thousands marching in organized demonstrations, sugar estates completely paralyzed, intense street battles with colonial police. The colonial government deployed troops, arrested hundreds of strike leaders, but couldn't stop the growing momentum. Out of this sustained turmoil emerged two leaders who would fundamentally shape modern Jamaica. Alexander Bustamante, a charismatic labor organizer who formed the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union in 1938, and Norman Manley, a brilliant lawyer who founded the People's National Party the same year. Through the 1940s and 1950s, these movements pushed relentlessly for constitutional reforms, universal adult suffrage, finally granted in 1944, and meaningful self-governance. Jamaica joined the short-lived West Indies Federation in 1958, a British attempt to create a unified Caribbean political union, but strategically withdrew in 1961 after a decisive referendum, choosing full independence instead of federation. On August 6, 1962, at the National Stadium in Kingston, Jamaica ceremonially lowered the British Union Jack and raised its own national flag for the first time. Black representing the people's strength and creativity, green symbolizing agriculture and hope, gold representing natural wealth and brilliant sunshine. Norman Manley and Alexander Bustamante stood as rival politicians representing different parties and visions, but both witnessed together the culmination of centuries of sustained struggle. Independence didn't magically solve everything overnight. Deep economic inequality, periodic political violence, and persistent colonial legacies remained serious challenges, but it marked something historically undeniable. Jamaica was now formally sovereign, its political destiny finally controlled by Jamaicans themselves. The island's modern identity, built systematically on resistance layered across generations, from Taino survival strategies through Maroon sovereignty to labor movements, finally had complete legal recognition and international legitimacy. The camera slowly returns to the Blue Mountains, where this journey began. Wind pushes steadily through the trees like distant ancestral drums calling across time. Somewhere near Moortown, deep in Portland Parish, a conch shell sounds, the abeng, once used strategically to send coded military messages across ridges during Maroon wars against British forces, now blown ceremonially to honor ancestors and remind descendants clearly. We are still here, still free, still remembering. The island is quiet now in this moment, but the land remembers absolutely everything. Taino paths where cassava once grew in careful mounds, Spanish cattle trails winding through Clarendon's plains, British plantation ruins slowly being reclaimed by persistent bush and vines. Maroon hideouts still hidden in Portland's mist-wrapped peaks. Morant Bay Courthouse, where Paul Bogle courageously demanded justice. Kingston streets, where workers struck collectively for dignity and fair wages. Every stone, every mountain pass, every curved coastline carries layered memory, not as oppressive burden, but as foundational strength. Jamaica's history across centuries is fundamentally not a story of passive suffering or victimhood. It's the relentless, strategic insistence on full humanity, generation after generation, courageously refusing to accept what empire declared was natural and inevitable. From indigenous resistance against Spanish encomienda, through Maroon republics carved into mountains, to emancipation struggles and independence movements, the pattern remains absolutely consistent. People fighting intelligently for the right to define themselves. And the mountains? They're still watching everything. Still keeping meticulous score, still carrying the accumulated memory of freedom won the hard way, through brilliant ambush and patient strategy, through organized strikes and powerful speeches, through spilled blood and applied brilliance. The Blue Mountain Ridge cuts the horizon like an unbreakable stone spine, beautiful and eternal, holding centuries of resistance in its dignified silence.